It's no secret the Magic community isn't perfect at evaluating the strength of cards. Sometimes the community simply won't realize how strong a card is until they actually get a chance to play with the cards themselves. In this list, we're going to go over cards that took everybody's surprise and became format-defining cards despite a lukewarm reception. Starting us off at number 10, we have Veil of Summer. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 green. It has the effect where you draw a card if your opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn, and you and your permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and black until the end of the turn. This means that you and your permanents can't be targeted or blue or black spells or abilities from blue and black resources. This card is extremely good at protecting your board or combos from interaction. If your opponent tried to cast a removal spell or discard spell, you could respond with Veil of Summer to both block their spell and draw a card, getting you a 2-for-1. Not only does this card give you card advantage, but this blowout can often leave your opponent in such a bad position tempo-wise that they can't recover from. In a lot of matchups, a single Veil of Summer can win you the entire game. When this card came out, players recognized that it was strong, but didn't see just how good it was. Players compared the card to Autumn's Veil, a very similar card that didn't have the ability to draw you a card. Autumn's Veil was always okay, but it wasn't as good as it seemed, as the upside of actually getting it to work just wasn't quite good enough to justify playing the card over other options. People thought the extra card Veil of Summer got you would make it better, but didn't expect how dominant it would be. The card ended up making green decks far too difficult to interact with. If your opponent ever had open green mana, you basically couldn't try to cast anything out of fear that your opponent would blow you out, getting a huge 2-for-1 and going way ahead in tempo. This led to Veil getting banned in multiple formats, being banned in its run through Standard, and still being banned in Pioneer, Explorer, and Historic. The reason this card is so low on this list is that while people did underestimate the card, they did predict that it would at least be okay to good. People just didn't see how strong the card would end up being. And at number 9, we have Goblin Rabblemaster. This is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It has the abilities where other Goblin creatures you control attack each combat if able. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token with haste, and whenever Rabblemaster attacks, it gets a +1/+0 for each other attacking Goblin until the end of the turn. Now, this card was seen as too slow at the time of its reveal. Most people considered it a casual card that wouldn't really see much competitive play. Paying 3 mana for a 2/2 just isn't very good, and having to wait a few turns for it to fill your board with goblins, as well as at forcing them to attack in bad situations, made people wary of the card. However, it proved to be quite the strong threat, not only in Standard but in older formats as well. As it turns out, the card was just really good at pumping out damage. The card would put out 1 damage the turn you played it, followed by 6 damage as you would have 2 1/1 goblins, making your Rabblemaster a 4-power creature. On the next turn it would put out 8 damage, then 10, and so on. This scaled extremely quickly, making it a must-kill threat. Even if your opponent did kill it pretty quickly, there was a good chance it would leave behind a token or two, which was pretty good value for a card that already got your opponent to commit a removal spell. The last issue was that the card didn't play great into blockers, but a few burn spells of your own would take care of that fine. All of this together made Rabblemaster a great threat not only in Standard, but in older formats like Legacy, where it's the premier game-ending threat for mono-red prison decks. Ever since Rabblemaster, the community has made sure to pay close attention to any similar cards. When Legion Warboss was spoiled, people knew the card would be pretty strong, and knew to pay attention to it in the following Standard format. And at number 8, we have Fury. This is a 3/3 elemental incarnation with a mana cost of 3 and 2 red. It has double strike, meaning it deals combat damage before other creatures, and then deals regular combat damage as well. And when Fury enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose amongst any number of target creatures or planeswalkers. It also has Evoke, exile a red card from your hand. This is an alternative casting cost, meaning you can cast it by just exiling a red card from your hand, but if you do, you have to sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. This card was a member of the cycle of Evoke Elementals, a cycle of 5 cards, 1 for each color, that you could evoke by exiling a card of their color from your hand. When the cycle was spoiled, a lot of players called this the worst member of the cycle. People just saw better homes for each of the other 4 elementals, but Fury seemed to come with too many downsides. It didn't have flash, meaning you couldn't cast it during your opponent's turn. It seemed far too situational as well, as 4 damage felt like too little to be able to deal with threats reliably. However, once the cards actually released, Fury ended up being one of the better members of the cycle. It turns out, being able to kill multiple threats made the card extremely powerful. Basically, every other member of the cycle lost you card advantage, as you would lose 2 cards to get rid of one of your opponents. However, Fury could easily maintain card parity. Combining this with the ability to cost no mana, and you could remove your opponent's board with no mana and without losing any card advantage, which is incredibly strong. This lets you develop your own board on your turn while dealing with a threat, or to keep your mana up for more interactions on their next turn. 4 damage was also often more than enough to deal with most threats, though there are some notable cards that do dodge it. Fury is often credited with pushing certain strategies like tribal decks out of the modern meta. All in all, Fury has completely overperformed the community's expectations. And at number 7, we have Approach of the Second Sun. This is a sorcery, the mana cost is 6 and 1 white. It has the effect where, if you cast this card from your hand, and you've casted another spell named Approach from the second sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, you gain 7 life and put this card into your deck 7th from the top. When this card was revealed, people thought it was a gimmick. It seemed far too slow and clunky, and these alternative win condition cards were usually pretty bad anyway. People figured this was another in the line of cards that were mostly fun build-arounds and weren't really viable in a competitive play. In actuality, Approach ended up being one of the better win conditions for blue-white control decks in Standard. As it turned out, being able to pay 7 mana and win the game was a lot faster than trying to play a creature in the late game and slowing attacking your opponent to death. Sure, you had to draw into the card twice, but the likelihood of your opponent being able to stop you in that time was really low if you were a control deck close to winning the game already. Gaining 7 life was also really useful for these decks, as it made it even more difficult for your opponent to kill you while you were waiting to draw into your next approach. Since rotating out of Standard, Approach has also been used as a finisher for certain builds of Lotus Field combo decks in Pioneer. These decks are built around untapping the field over and over and make tons of mana, play cards like Pore Over the Pages to draw cards, and finally find a way to win the game. This deck is more than capable of making and drawing the cards it needs to win the game, and being able to just win the game without any of the steps was just really nice for the deck. All in all, Approach has just been far stronger than people gave the card credit for initially. And at number 6, we have Ledger Shredder. This is a 1/3 bird advisor with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. It has the ability where, whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, it connives. This means you draw a card and then discard a card, and if you discarded a non-land card, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Shredder. Ledger Shredder went largely unnoticed during spoiler season. It seemed like a reasonable card, but largely unimpressive. However, once you actually start playing with the card, particularly in older formats like Pioneer and Modern, you realize just how strong of a card Shredder is. As it turns out, Shredder is very easy to grow into a much larger threat, and gives you a ton of card selection to boot. First off, players casting 2 spells in a turn is a very common occurrence, especially if you're playing the Shredder and are actively trying to trigger its ability. If you're a deck with a lot of cheap spells, you should be able to trigger Shredder on every one of your turns, and your opponent will have to double spell quite often as well. This means you'll quickly be able to throw counters onto the Shredder, as you'll be discarding non-land cards at some point. You'll probably draw more spells than lands, so you'll eventually trigger Shredder and only have spells in your hand. Not to mention, it's frequently the right choice to keep a land to play next turn and discard a less useful card to pump up your Shredder. Being able to grow your Shredder also lets you do very important things like dodge Lightning Bolt. Bolt can kill Shredder if it has no counters on it, but once you pup it once, it will be bolt proof. Its stat line is generally very solid. It's hard to remove, and while it doesn't have much power, it's easy enough to put it up to at least 2 or 3 power, enough to make it a threat. On top of all of this, there are tons of reasons why putting cards into your graveyard is actively good. For example, cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler requires you to have 4 different card types amongst cards in your graveyard. Shredder filling your graveyard makes the card and tons of other cards even stronger. Shredder really came out of nowhere and has ended up being a staple in several formats. And at number 5, we have Arclight Phoenix. This is a 3/2 Phoenix with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It has flying and haste, meaning it can attack the turn it enters the battlefield. It also has the ability where, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you cast 3 or more instant and or sorcery spells this turn, you return Arclight from your graveyard to the battlefield. I've mentioned this card a few times in this channel as a deck that's seen play in formats like Pioneer, but interestingly, players didn't really expect the card to perform very well when it was first spoiled. Players really expected casting 3 instants or sorceries to be too difficult after having to put Arclight into your graveyard first, not to mention possibly too slow. However, this ended up being far more practical than it first seemed. Lots of the cards that were used to put Arclight into your graveyard were also instant and sorcery cards, such as Chart of Course, Lightning Axe, or Faithless Looting, before it was banned in Modern. On top of that, it turned out that being a bit slower than other, similar payoffs ended up not being that huge of a deal, because you could cast any instant or sorceries you wanted, you could use them to control the game and slow down your opponent, and then get your Phoenix back on turn 3 or 4 and start closing the game. The deck is also far more resilient than it may seem, being able to get back a Phoenix multiple times over the course of a game. Having to cast 3 spells makes it seem difficult to do more than once, as you'll have to use 3 whole cards, which would make your hand size quickly dwindle. However, since you're often casting spells like Opt or Consider, which draw you a card, you can often easily keep your hand full and trigger your Phoenix. All of this made Phoenix far more practical than it seemed at first blush, leading to the card's price spiking several times its initial price a few weeks after release. And at number 4, we have Death's Shadow. This is a 13/13 avatar with a mana cost of 1 black. It has the ability where it gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. This card wasn't practically good when it was first released. In its standard format, the card was far too inconsistent, as there weren't enough ways to control your life to get Shadow big enough. In older formats, these tools were available. You had the combination of fetch lands and shock lands. Fetch lands allow you to pay 1 life and sacrifice them to find a land of a certain basic land type and put it onto the battlefield, and shock lands are lands with basic land types that require you to pay 2 life, or they enter the battlefield tapped. This lets you choose to pay 3 life for your land drop. If you combine this with cards that require you to pay life, such as the extremely powerful Thoughtseize, you'll be able to lower your life total extremely quickly and control it fairly accurately. These cards were all very frequently played and were all available when Death Shadow was printed in Worldwake. However, the card didn't see play in older formats until several years later. It first started seeing play in Legacy a couple of years after Worldwake's release, but it didn't show up in Modern until 2016, a full 6 years after the card was printed. This is one of the few times we know of where a card has come out and the shelf for the deck has existed, but wasn't discovered for years after the card's release. This is becoming increasingly rare in the modern age with online play getting more popular, but it still hasn't entirely disappeared. We'll talk about another example of this shortly, but before that, and at number 3, we have Field of the Dead. This is a land with no land types that enters the battlefield tap. It can tap for 1 colorless mana and has the ability where, whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. On release, this card was mostly thought of as a commander card. It seemed a bit too slow and impractical to work in competitive Magic. Getting 7 lands on the battlefield was often hard enough, but lots of decks didn't even run 7 different lands. So getting 7 lands that were all different was a very tall order. And sure, getting a free 2/2 each time you play a land was strong, but it didn't seem like it was good enough to be worth it. However, people really underestimated how broken getting this effect off for no mana really was. It turns out there were enough good to okay lands not only in formats like Modern and Pioneer, but even in Standard to make mana bases that functioned perfectly fine while also letting you get 7 or more different lands out in time to turn Field on. Cards like Shapeshift and Primeval Titan allowed decks to find particular lands incredibly easily, and being able to summon just a ton of zombies for no mana was ridiculously strong. It was so strong in fact that the card ended up getting banned in multiple formats, from Standard to Pioneer to Modern, taking a lot of people by surprise. And at number 2, we have Nexus of Fate. This is an instant with the mana cost of 5 and 2 blue. It is an ability where, whenever it would be put into the graveyard, you shuffle into your owner's library instead. And it has the effect where you take an extra turn after this one. Now, this card is quite the story. This was the Buy a Box promo for Core Set 2019, a promo that you could only get by buying a box from an official Wizards of the Coast game store. They couldn't be pulled in packs, and they couldn't be bought in any pre-built decks or anything. This exclusivity posed a problem for competitive decks, so when Wizards launched these promos, they said publicly that they would make sure that they weren't competitively relevant, as that would lead to a very big issue if it would become too difficult to get them. You can probably see where this is going based on the video title, but generally, people ignored these Buy a Box promos. However, one team saw that Nexus of Fate had potential. They built a deck called Turbofog. This was built around playing tons of cards like Haze of Pollen and Root Snare to stop their opponent from ever dealing combat damage to them, and play tons of planeswalkers like Nissa, Steward of Elements, and Teferi, Hero Dominaria, to make sure they can keep drawing more fog cards to not die. Eventually, getting their deck so small and being able to see so many cards each turn that they could cast a Nexus, shuffle into their deck, and then on their next turn draw another copy of Nexus to basically take infinite turns, eventually killing their opponent however they wanted. This deck ended up being one of the best decks in the format, and people were completely blindsided by it. This team of builders arrived at a major tournament with the deck and took top spots, and in a big tournament like that, a completely unknown deck taking a top 8 is basically unheard of. Now, this ended up being quite the controversy, as the exclusivity of the card did make building the deck fairly difficult. The format was ultimately able to correct and adjust the deck's presence, but the deck completely coming out of nowhere and surprising the pros like this is extremely rare. And at number 1, we have Lion's Eye Diamond. This is an artifact with the mana cost of 0. It is an ability where you can sacrifice it and discard your entire hand to add 3 color of any one mana, but you can only activate this at any time you can activate an instant. To clarify, this means you can't activate the card while trying to pay mana to cast a spell or activate an ability, as you can with other mana abilities. This means you can't try and cast a spell in your hand and then use LED to pay for it, getting around its massive downside to discard your entire hand. This card was basically a fixed version of Black Lotus, one of the most broken cards in all of Magic, that tried to make the card fair by nerfing it into the ground. When this card first came out all the way back in Mirage, it was considered a joke card. No one could imagine any way to take advantage of it. After all, how could you use mana with an empty hand? You wouldn't have any spells to cast. This remained true for a while, but as more and more cards came out and people figured out how to play the game better, people realized that the card was actually incredibly powerful. There were tons of ways to make use of this card. One of the most common was to draw a spell and then crack LED in response. For example, the card Infernal Tutor allows you to reveal a card in your hand and then add another copy of that card from your deck to your hand. But if your hand is empty, you can search your library for any card. What you could do is cast Infernal Tutor and then crack LED in response, discarding your entire hand, basically letting you get 3 mana and then put any card you want from your deck into your hand. Another way to use this card was with the Arclight Salvagers. This is a 4-mana creature with the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 white to put an artifact from your graveyard into your hand. What you would do is get your Salvagers out and then cast LED and use it, getting 3 mana. You use Salvagers to grab your LED and crack it again. Since it costs 1 less to get your LED out of the graveyard than it makes, you'll net 1 mana each time. This lets you get infinite mana, which you can then use to cast something like Walking Ballista for X equals 20 to be able to burn your opponent to death. And these are just a couple of ways that LED has been used, but they show the ways people were able to make the card far stronger than people thought it would be. By manipulating this stack and combining it with stronger and stronger graveyard effects that were printed in Magic, the card went from a joke to a contender for one of the strongest cards in Magic. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments.